The air around the old, crumbling inn on the edge of Willow Bend, Missouri, carries a stench that never quite fades. A sweet, sickly odor that clings to your skin like damp fog. Locals blame the rot of warped timbers and decades of neglect. But those who've dared to cross its threshold tell a different tale. They speak of a smell that seeps into your clothes, your hair, your nightmares. Before we unravel the chilling saga of Eliza Blackwell, the widow who married 4 men in a single year and cooked them all in the same cursed iron pot. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more bone-chilling stories from America's forgotten past. Drop a comment below. What state are you watching from? These terrors didn't pick favorites. They festered everywhere. The truth about Eliza Blackwell's gruesome deeds stayed buried for over a century, until a farmer's plow in 1962 struck iron and bone in a field just outside Willow Bend, unearthing fragments that made even seasoned sheriffs turn away in revulsion. The discovery sent whispers rippling through the county, reviving tales of a woman whose culinary genius masked a monstrous appetite. But to understand the full weight of her crimes, we need to step back to the spring of 1854, when Willow Bend was a speck of desperation on the edge of the American frontier, the birth of a boom town. Willow Bend wasn't the glittering deadwood of legend, with its saloons and showdowns. It was a grimy, makeshift settlement hugging the muddy banks of the Missouri River, where the air was thick with mosquitoes and the ground was churned to muck by wagon wheels and miners' boots. In the early 1850s, rumors of gold flakes in nearby streams and fertile land for the taking drew a flood of settlers, men and women fleeing debts, wars, or just the monotony of eastern cities. By 1854, the town's population had ballooned from a handful of families to over 300 souls in just months. There was no sheriff, no doctor, no church, just a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, lean-tos carved into the riverbank, and a few rickety wooden buildings that charged a king's ransom for a cot or a cup of watery coffee. Life in Willow Bend was brutal. Disease swept through the camps like wildfire. Dysentery and cholera claiming lives faster than the river could carry them away. Men worked dawn to dusk, panning for gold or breaking their backs on claims that rarely paid out. Food was scarce. Hardtack, beans, and the occasional stringy rabbit, if you were lucky. Starvation was a constant shadow, and trust was a luxury no one could afford. Into this lawless, hungry world stepped Eliza Blackwell, a 32-year-old widow whose arrival would change Willow Bend forever. The widow's arrival. Eliza rolled into town on a creaking wagon train from Kentucky in March 1854, her face half hidden by a faded bonnet, her gray eyes sharp as a hawk's. She was no delicate flower. Her hands were rough, scarred from years over open flames, and her prematurely gray hair was tied back in a severe bun that spoke of practicality over vanity. She carried little: a battered leather trunk, a Bible with pages stained a rusty brown, and an enormous cast-iron cooking pot, so heavy it took 3 mules and 4 men to unload it from the wagon. She told anyone who asked that her husband, a merchant named Thomas, had died of cholera on the trail, leaving her with nothing but debts and determination. Her story tugged at heartstrings in a place where loss was commonplace, and folks admired her grit. A lone woman carving out a life in the wilderness. Within days, Eliza had sweet-talked the owner of the town's only inn, a sagging, 2-story structure at the crossroads of the main trail and the path to the richest claims, into selling it for a pittance. By mid-March, she'd hung a hand-painted sign above the door: Blackwell's Rest, hot meals, clean beds, fair prices, no questions asked. The inn became a beacon in the chaos of Willow Bend, its windows glowing with lamplight, the air thick with the aroma of simmering stews and fresh-baked bread. That pot, the size of a barrel and blackened from years of use, was the centerpiece of her kitchen. It sat over a roaring fire, bubbling with dishes that made men forget their aching backs and empty pockets. Eliza's cooking was nothing short of miraculous in a place where meals were usually a grim necessity. Her stews were thick with tender meat and vegetables that seemed impossibly fresh, her cornbread golden and warm, her coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Men who'd been eating ash-caked beans for months practically wept at the first spoonful. But there was something about Eliza that set folks on edge, even as they sang her praises. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, which had a habit of lingering on a man's frame, like she was sizing up a side of beef. She spoke softly, her voice laced with a Kentucky drawl, but her questions were sharp, probing into a man's past, his plans, his coin. And that pot, it was always simmering, always full, no matter how scarce supplies were in Willow Bend. When asked how she managed such feasts, Eliza would chuckle, mentioning river folk who traded venison and elk for flour, or old family recipes that stretched a little into a lot. Most folks were too busy licking their bowls clean to press her further. But a few, like Elias Crow, a grizzled trapper with a butcher's eye, started to wonder about the meat in those stews. It was tender, marbled just so, with a flavor that didn't quite match deer, pork, or the first husband, Jonathan Hale. Jonathan Hale was the first to fall under Eliza's spell. A 28-year-old miller from Ohio, he arrived in Willow Bend on a rainy March evening, his broad shoulders stooped from months on the trail. He carried a leather pouch heavy with silver coins from selling his family's mill, dreaming of staking a claim that would set him up for life. The moment he stepped into Blackwell's Rest, the smell of Eliza's cooking hit him like a warm embrace. She greeted him with a steaming bowl of stew and a smile that made the room feel less lonely. Jonathan weathered by solitude, was smitten. Eliza fussed over him. Extra helpings of meat, coffee poured before he could ask, questions about his plans that felt like genuine care. She'd sit with him after supper, her gray eyes fixed on his calloused hands as he spoke of his hopes for a big strike out. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Jonathan fixed the inn's creaking stairs, patched holes in the roof, and swapped stories with Eliza by the firelight. She laughed at his jokes, her fingers brushing his arm as she refilled his mug. By April 10th, barely 3 weeks after his arrival, they were married in a simple ceremony led by a traveling preacher named Amos Reed. The wedding feast was a marvel. Tables groaned under platters of cornbread, roasted vegetables, and that signature stew, so rich and flavorful it left men speechless. Guests toasted the couple, marveling at the tender meat spiced with herbs no one could name. "Best meal I ever ate," one miner slurred, raising his glass. Jonathan beamed, proud to call Eliza his wife. But 3 weeks later, on May 1st, Jonathan woke writhing in pain, his face flushed with fever, his stomach cramping as if he'd swallowed glass. Eliza tended to him, her face a mask of concern, spooning broth into his mouth as he grew weaker. The town's only doctor, a half-trained barber named Silas Boone, diagnosed river fever, a catch-all for the ailments that plagued the frontier. By May 3rd, Jonathan was dead. Eliza buried him in the small cemetery on the hill, overlooking Willow Bend, her black veil fluttering in the spring wind, her hands clutching his handkerchief as she wept. The townsfolk rallied around her, bringing flowers and firewood, murmuring about the cruelty of fate. Poor Eliza, widowed so young, so soon. The inn reopened within days, and if anything, the food got better. The stew took on a deeper, more complex flavor. The meat so tender it seemed to dissolve on the tongue. Guests noticed Eliza seemed quieter, her grief etched into her pale face. But her kitchen never faltered. If anything, it thrived. The second husband, Marcus Reed, no relation to the preacher, arrived in mid-May, a blacksmith from Illinois, with arms like tree trunks and a dream of building a forge to serve the growing town. His anvil and tools clinked in the back of his wagon, and his pockets held enough coin to make him a desirable tenant. Eliza took to him immediately, mending his torn shirts, serving him the best cuts from her pot, and asking about his plans with a curiosity that felt personal. Marcus, a widower himself after losing his wife to smallpox, found comfort in Eliza's attention. They'd talk late into the night, her sharing tales of her childhood, carefully vague, him describing the forge he'd build to anchor Willow Bend. The other guests noticed the favoritism. Marcus's plates piled higher, his coffee always steaming, his room swept cleaner than anyone else's. Some grumbled, but most were just happy to eat Eliza's cooking, which seemed to improve with every passing week. On June 5th, Marcus and Eliza married, the ceremony doubling as a town celebration. The feast outdid even Jonathan's wedding. Stew brimming with meat so succulent, it brought tears to eyes. Cornbread fluffy as clouds, and a strange, tangy sauce Eliza called her secret blend. Marcus called her his kitchen angel, raising a toast to their future. The town cheered, though a few, like Elias Crow, eyed the pot warily, muttering about meat that didn't sit right. By June 28th, Marcus was dead. The symptoms were eerily familiar. Gut-wrenching pain, a fever that burned through him in days. Silas Boone, scratching his head, called it bad meat, maybe, or tainted river water. Eliza's grief was a performance for the ages. 2 days locked in her room, emerging in black mourning clothes, her face pale as bone. She buried Marcus next to Jonathan, her sobs echoing through the cemetery as she clutched his hammer like a relic. The townsfolk, moved by her loss, brought her bread and blankets, vowing to help her keep the inn running. Such a tragedy, they whispered, twice widowed in 3 months. But the stew, it was better than ever. Richer, deeper, with a flavor that hooked you like a drug. Elias Crow, who'd butchered elk and bear across the frontier, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He'd prod the meat with his fork, muttering, "This ain't venison, ain't pork neither, but a portions." Her tragic widow's tale kept questions at bay. The third husband, Lucas Grant. By July, whispers of Eliza's widow curse began to circulate, half joking, half uneasy. The inn remained packed, though, men drawn by the promise of a warm bed and a meal that felt like home. Lucas Grant arrived on a steamboat from St. Louis, a gambler with a quick smile and a pouch of winnings that jingled when he walked. He was all charm, dealing cards in the inn's common room, spinning tales of riverboat hustles and narrow escapes. Eliza was captivated, or so it seemed. She'd linger at his table, laughing at his jokes, her gray eyes glinting as she refilled his plate. Their courtship was different. More romantic. They married on August 12th, the wedding a spectacle of music and whiskey. The feast was a triumph. Stew layered with flavors so complex it felt like witchcraft. Eliza claimed she'd added exotic spices from a trader downriver, and no one questioned it, too busy savoring every bite. Lucas, grinning ear to ear, called it a meal fit for a king. But by August 29th, he was screaming in pain, his body racked with fever, muttering about sweet poison in his delirium. Silas Boone, now visibly uneasy, suggested food poisoning, but admitted he couldn't be sure. Lucas was buried in a rush, Eliza handling every detail, citing respect for the dead. The town mourned, but the whispers grew louder. 3 husbands, 3 graves, all in 5 months. Elias Crow wasn't the only one asking questions now. A miner named Caleb Holt, who'd worked as a cook's assistant back east, noticed the inn's pantry was oddly sparse for the feasts Eliza produced. Where were the barrels of salted pork? The sacks of potatoes? She'd wave off inquiries with talk of river traders and secret suppliers. But the math didn't add up. And that smell, sweet, cloying, always strongest near the kitchen. The fourth husband, Nathaniel Voss. By September, Willow Bend was buzzing with unease, though Eliza's cooking kept the inn full. Nathaniel Voss arrived on September 10th, a farmer from Virginia, with land deeds and a sack of gold dust sewn into his coat. He was sturdy, practical, with a quiet strength that made him a natural fit for Eliza's attentions. She moved fast. Extra portions, late-night chats about his plans to buy a claim. Her fingers tracing the seams of his coat as if counting the gold within. The wedding feast was a masterpiece, even by Eliza's standards. The stew had multiple textures, tender chunks, silky shreds, all woven together with a spice blend that left men speechless. Like nothing in God's creation, one guest murmured, spoon trembling. But Nathaniel's end came faster, messier. On October 20th, raised voices echoed from the inn's upstairs rooms. Nathaniel shouting about missing gold. Strange smells from the cellar. By October 22nd, he was dead, his body racked with convulsions, his eyes wide with terror. Silas Boone, now openly skeptical, wanted to examine the body, but Eliza refused, citing religious custom. She buried him herself, her black veil hiding her face as she shoveled dirt over his coffin. The town was on edge. Elias Crow, unable to ignore his instincts any longer, waited until Eliza left for one of her supply runs and broke into the inn's root cellar. What he found shattered him. Jars lined the shelves, each labeled in Eliza's neat handwriting. Shoulder, J.H., April 54. Loin, M.R., June 54. Thigh, L.G., August 54. A leather-bound journal detailed yields, weights, cuts, cooking times. Human flesh, preserved with a butcher's precision. And in the corner, that iron pot, its blackened surface gleaming with layers of fat and blood, as if it had a life of its own. The unraveling, Elias didn't confront Eliza alone. He knew better. He gathered Caleb Holt and a few trusted miners, showing them the cellar's horrors. The journal was worse than the jars. Eliza had documented everything. How she'd laced her husband's meals with arsenic, ground fine and masked by sweet herbs. How she'd butchered their bodies in the dead of night, using skills honed over years. How she boiled entire torsos in that pot, rendering fat for baking, saving bones for broth. The marriages were a calculated ruse, legal claims to their assets, their isolation making them perfect prey. Most chilling was the revelation that Willow Bend wasn't her first stop. The journal hinted at earlier victims in Kentucky, Illinois, even Ohio, towns she'd left behind when suspicions grew too heavy. On November 10th, the town confronted Eliza in the inn's common room. Elias, holding the journal like a Bible. Caleb, clutching a jar labeled NV, October 54. The room fell silent as Eliza stood by her pot, stirring a stew that would never be served. Her confession was ice cold, delivered with the calm of a shopkeeper tallying accounts. "Waste not, want not," she said. "They provided in life, and they provided after. Why let good meat rot when it feeds the living?" She'd learned her trade young, she said, apprenticing with a butcher in Louisville who didn't ask questions. Human flesh, she claimed, was sweeter than pork, more tender than beef. And in the frontier, where livestock was scarce, it was practical. Her pot, custom forged in Kentucky, was designed for the task. Deep enough for a torso, thick enough to hold heat without scorching, with a drain for collecting fat she used in her cornbread. The town's reaction was a mix of nausea and rage. Men who'd savored her stews vomited on the floor. Others drew knives, screaming for blood. Eliza didn't flinch. She admitted to at least 10 victims before Willow Bend, moving from town to town, changing names, perfecting her craft. The marriages ensured no one questioned her inheritance of gold, silver, or deeds. The feasts? A way to erase evidence while profiting from hungry boarders. Her only regret, she said, was that Nathaniel had grown suspicious too soon. The trial and execution. Willow Bend had no jail, no courthouse, but the town demanded justice. A makeshift trial began on November 12th in the town's grain warehouse, with preacher Amos Reed presiding as judge. The evidence was overwhelming. The jars, the journal, the pot caked with human residue. Silas Boone testified about the suspicious deaths, admitting his misdiagnoses. Elias Crow described the cellar's contents with a butcher's detail, his voice shaking as he explained the texture of human flesh. Eliza offered no defense, her gray eyes scanning the crowd like she was picking her next meal. "I'm not the only one," she said. "The frontier's full of shadows like me." The jury, 12 minors, pale with shock, took an hour to convict her. On November 15th, at dawn, Eliza Blackwell was hanged from an oak tree on the hill where her husbands were buried. She went to the gallows unrepentant, her final words a warning. Others are out there, cooking, killing, waiting. The crowd watched in silence as her body swayed. The river's murmur, the only sound. The pot was destroyed with sledgehammers, its pieces scattered across the wilderness. Blackwell's rest was burned to the ground, the root cellar filled with stones. Willow Bend unraveled in the months that followed. Families fled, unable to stomach the memories. By 1855, the town was a ghost, the legacy of horror. In 1962, a farmer plowing a field near Willow Bend hit iron. A shard of Eliza's pot, still clinging to human bone. The coroner confirmed the remains were human, but sealed the report, deeming it too gruesome for public record. The fragments were reburied in an unmarked site. A final attempt to bury Eliza's legacy. Historians now see her as one of America's earliest serial killers. Her methodical approach, victim selection, poisoning, butchery, eerily modern. Her journal suggested a network of frontier criminals, though no accomplices were ever found. The isolation of places like Willow Bend, with no law or oversight, was her playground. What haunts you most about this tale? Was Eliza a lone monster, or were there others, as she claimed, hiding in plain sight? Comment below with your thoughts. Like if this story gripped you, and share it with a friend who loves true crime mysteries. Subscribe for more tales of horror from America's shadowed past, because these stories, they happened. Or did they? Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows.